welcome to the first of hopefully many weird podcasts. I'm your host, I suppose is what I'm called. My name's Lindsay. But before we start, I want to set the bar as low as I possibly can. I'm not very funny, so if you're bored, I don't blame you. Maybe this will help you fall asleep if you are an insomniac like I am. Also, I am kind of an introvert, so I try my best to dig up information and research things and look up facts and interesting stories without actually having to talk to anyone. So really, I just want to have conversations with myself about weird things and tell crazy stories. So if you're into serial killers or unexplained events or folklore or anything else that's kind of strange, then you're in pretty good company here. And so yeah, that's me essentially. This first episode is a doozy because why hold back, especially for the first episode? And so we're going to be talking about Canada's pioneer serial killer, Clifford Olson. By the time I was born, he had already been put away in prison, but I still remember growing up and hearing his name all the time. So he is just somebody that ever since I was really teeny tiny, his name has just always been around. So Christmas conjures up images of, you know, festive merrymaking, jolly songs about snow and reindeer and decorations of twinkle lights and garlands and glitter and all those, you know, wonderful, lovely things. But for the Weller family, Christmas would be robbed of that merriness that we often enjoy, making the first of a string of tragedies committed by a man who would soon be known as the Beast of British Columbia. Clifford Robert Olson Jr. He was born January 1st, 1940 in Vancouver, BC. He grew up near Richmond, BC, and he was the eldest of 4 children. His father was a Canadian serviceman during the Second World War, although records don't show if he actually served in active duty or not. And I think at one point he was a milkman. I don't know. So as a child, and this is pretty important and it's pretty common when it comes to a lot of serial killers, but not all of them. As a child, he was known to torment dogs and cats, which is sort of a marker of callous and unemotional traits, which we're going to talk about that in a little bit. He would skip classes. He was held back in school several times. He was a bully. He was a thief. He himself was also bullied, so he took up boxing for a time so he could defend himself. And apparently he was really good at it. His boxing instructor gave him rave reviews. So as I mentioned, Clifford, I'm sure, could have been diagnosed with any number of childhood disorders. I am a psychology student, which makes me a really annoying person to be around, because I think I know stuff, but I actually don't know. But what comes to mind is something that's called callous and unemotional traits, which is kids who are showing sort of symptoms of being psychopathic or symptoms of being psychopaths, but we don't want to stigmatize kids at that age. We want to, you know, get them into treatment and help them and all those sorts of things, because once you're an adult and you're a psychopath, that is extremely difficult to not only spot, but to treat. So I am reaching out here. I don't know if there's any mental health experts who might have some input on that. That would be really appreciated. Although this is the first episode, so I'm assuming that nobody's actually listening. So anyway, I have not seen any official diagnoses in any of the kind of cursory research that I've done, but definitely if I was to be told that he had callous and unemotional traits, I would 100% believe it. As an adult, Clifford would score 38 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist, which it's a diagnostic tool developed by a Canadian doctor, actually, Dr. Robert D. Hare, to detect psychopathic traits in adults. So as a side note, psychopathy is widely misused term. Like, people often say, oh my God, that person's such a psycho or whatever. So I'm going to just quickly define it here, just a basic definition. And this is according to Psychology Today, just to give you some context of what I mean when I'm referencing a psychopath or psychopathic behavior. Psychopathy is among the most difficult disorders to spot. The psychopath can appear normal, even charming. Underneath, he lacks conscience and empathy, making him manipulative, volatile, and often, but by no means always, criminal. She is an object of popular fascination and clinical anguish. Adult psychopathy, and this is what I was referencing earlier, is largely impervious to treatment. Though programs are in place to treat callous, unemotional youth in hopes of preventing them from maturing into psychopaths. Psychopathy is a spectrum disorder and can be diagnosed only using the 20-item Hare psychopathy checklist. That's the doctor that I mentioned earlier. The bar for clinical psychopathy is a score of 30 or more. Clifford, as mentioned, scored 38. Brain anatomy, genetics, and a person's environment may all contribute to the development of psychopathic traits. So between 1957 and 1981, Clifford was arrested no less than 94 times for various crimes, including, but not limited to, sexual assault, fraud, armed robbery, and by the time he was 41, he had only spent 4 years of his adult life as a free man. He escaped prison several times. He had his parole revoked several times. And he committed sexual assault several times. Peter Worthington, the founding editor and columnist of the Toronto Sun, had developed a bit of a rapport with Olson while Olson was in prison. And spoiler alert, he ends up in prison. So this is an excerpt from a Maclean's article from August 18th, 1997. Peter states, "I guess I understood Olson as well as almost anyone. Despite an order banning him from any contacts with the media, he managed to clear the way for me to visit him every couple of weeks during the better part of a year in the early 90s when he was in Ontario's Kingston Penitentiary. I also received almost daily phone calls from him. We are conditioned by novels, TV, and movies to expect serial killers to be scary and sinister. Not Olson. He comes across as almost benign, ingratiating, friendly, and utterly unthreatening, which makes him all the more frightening. Olson's young victims had no chance when he turned on the smarm. As for remorse for his crimes, no way. Olson claims regret, but only as a ploy. Peter, he would say when asked, words can't express how badly I feel for the families of these kids. Followed immediately by something like, say, how do you think the Blue Jays will do tonight? So that again really, really demonstrates when we talk about psychopathy that veneer of charm and kindness and graciousness and all those things, but then of course there is that interior of maliciousness that exists beneath the surface, and that is Clifford Olson. In 1980, Olson met his soon-to-be wife, Joan Hale, who had by this point already survived an abusive marriage. Olson and Hale had a son together, Clifford III, and they were married in May of 1981. This is a vital part of Olson's story, and it's going to come up a bit later. During this time, Olson was in the midst of his killing spree, so it's not like they were married for 20 years and he kind of slowly digressed into this murderous thing that terrorized the Vancouver area. No, like he was already killing people at this point, and from what I remember, he killed his next victim 3 days after they were married. I do want to note, though, that his wife, Joan, does claim that she had no idea that her husband was doing this. Whether or not you believe that or I believe that, I don't think I mean, I can't say. I don't have an opinion either way. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. It's not up to me. But to give you an idea of the extent of Clifford's crimes, most most serial killers, they'll have a cooling off period. They'll kill somebody and then they cool off for a while and then they go off and they find another victim. Clifford began killing in November of 1980. And by the time he was arrested on August 12th, 1981, he had killed at least 11 children. Now, he did tell law enforcement years and years later, he tried to convince them that he was probably guilty of murdering 30 or 40 other people and all this, that, and the other. But that did kind of send law enforcement down a wild goose chase, and there was never any substantiation to those claims. So as far as we know, the number is 11, but possibly more. His murders, I referenced this at the beginning with talking about Christmas. His murders began with poor 12-year-old Christine Ann Weller. Christine was last seen riding her bike near her home. And can you imagine that? Like, I remember being a child in the 80s, and I remember riding my bike all over the neighborhood on my own, like carefree. You don't even think about, I mean, yeah, there's stranger danger and things like that, but that is your space still. Like, your house isn't just your space. It's like that whole neighborhood and that community is your space. So to have somebody come into that space and just take you, like, I can't even imagine the terror that she must have felt. She was abducted November 20th, 1980. A poor man walking his dog on Christmas Day found her, and she had been tragically strangled and stabbed. Allegedly, police didn't initially treat Christine as a missing person, so I'm not clear if they thought she had run away or what it was. And I actually noticed too, in looking into his other victims, that the initial response was that these kids had run away for some of them, and that they were immediately treated with the seriousness that perhaps they would now. I'm not saying that the police were incompetent or anything like that. That's not a conversation I'm going to have right now. But definitely there was a couple of cases where, the alarm bells weren't raised as early as I guess they possibly could have been. So over the course of the next 9 months, Clifford would claim 10 more lives that we are aware of. Colleen Marianne Dagnon, 13. She went missing from Surrey, BC, and was found 5 months later. Sandra Wolfsteiner was 16, and Sandra was hitchhiking and was picked up by Olson. She was found in a nearby forest. And a quick thing about hitchhiking too, I remember as a kid, like, we would see hitchhikers all the time. Like, it was just something that was super common to get from one place to another, and it wasn't even something that we really feared, or, I mean, I never did it, but I mean, if I was driving with friends and we picked up a hitchhiker, like, that is just something that I was never really concerned about. But certainly in the wake of things like Clifford Olson and various serial killers that really emerged in the 70s and 80s and whatnot, like, I don't think I've seen nearly as many hitchhikers as I used to, and also with the laws changing surrounding hitchhiking and all that stuff. But anyway, Ada Anita Court was 13, and she was on her way to visit a friend. She disappeared and wasn't found for 2 months. Simon Partington, Simon was 9. He was also initially thought to be a runaway, allegedly, and he was riding a bike to a friend's house in Surrey when he disappeared. Then we have Judy Kozma, 14, Raymond King II at 15, Sigrun Arndt at 18, Terry Lynn Carson, 15, Louis Chartrand, 17, Darren Todd Johnsrud, 16. I want to talk about him for a little bit because what Clifford did to him led to his parents really changing the face of law enforcement and changing the way Canada treats missing kids. He was 16. He went to the mall on April 21st, 1981 to run errands. He was picking up laundry, and I think he was going to Shoppers Drug Mart to pick up some things, stuff like that. Olson lured Darren into his car by offering him a job washing windows for $10 an hour. In 1981, $10 an hour would have been incredibly lucrative and tempting. Like, I definitely would have gotten into that car at that point, I think, except that I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't have. Was I scared of strangers? I don't remember. I might have been afraid of strangers. I'm afraid of people now, so who knows. $10 an hour is a lot. I mean, it was only a few years ago that I was making $10.50 at a retail job. So at that point, like that is a huge sum of money. And I guess allegedly this was a tactic that Olson would often use to get people into his car. So this was the case with poor Darren. He got into Olson's car and was never seen again. He was initially declared as being a runaway yet again. And of course, well, I don't want to say of course, but unfortunately, I mean, these poor parents who are, you know, worried and terrified and angry and scared and all of these things, they're also being looked at as suspects. So on the one hand, you know, the disappearance isn't being treated seriously. And then, you know, when it does start to become, you know, a bit more of a serious thing, they are treated as prime suspects. And I get it. I mean, the police need to question, you know, everybody who's, you know, kind of close to the victim. But I just trying to put myself in their shoes and be empathetic, that is just such unimaginable pain. After several weeks, the Rosenfelds finally received word that a boy's body had been found dead, and the RCMP would need Darren's dental records in order to identify the body. So this, I mean, this whole thing is really fucked up, but this is, again, just trying to be empathetic to the parents and how they were being treated and how they felt that they weren't being taken seriously or looked after by law enforcement and all this kind of stuff. Initially, it was reported that the body wasn't actually Darren's. So when you think about that, you're already worried, you're scared, you just desperately want to find your son. You get a report comes back to you saying that this dead body of this boy has been found. It might be his. So now you're thinking like, oh my God, my son's dead. And you're kind of grieving and you're angry and all this kind of stuff. And then you're told it's not him. So you go back to the whole like, oh, thank God, I'm glad he's not dead. But then like what's happened to him? I don't know. The next day, May 11th, the RCMP contacted the Rosenfelds with the news that they had actually made a mistake and the body was indeed that of Darren. My heart goes out to them still. Like, I mean, decades later, I am just completely, like, I am so heartbroken for them. What a horrendous tragedy. What a thing to go through. So, in the wake of all of this, the Rosenfelds began the Victims of Violence Canadian Centre for Missing Children. It's a registered charity that provides, and I'm reading this excerpt directly from the charity's website. So it's a registered charity that provides support and assistance to victims of violent crime and their families, and provides information relevant to the prevention of crimes against children. So if you're wanting to find out more about that charity, which I highly recommend you do, I mean, if we're putting in the effort to find out, you know, and talk about serial killers and murders and stuff, I think at the very least we can do is support the victims and their families, not just in thoughts and prayers, but, you know, donating and publicizing that as well, and talking about like these wonderful children and who they were and everything their families have done since then. Like, there's just, I just want to try and maintain some kind of a balance there. But visit their website, victimsofviolence.on.ca. And I'll say that again at the end of this episode as well. So these victims abducted from bus stops and malls while riding bikes or while hitchhiking, they were all between the ages of 9 and 17. Some were raped, some were strangled and bludgeoned, some were stabbed. I did visit some sources that went into detail about what Olson did to these children, and I'll be completely honest. I mean, what he did was so appalling, and these are children that we're talking about, and I feel it would be gratuitous to share those details. We all know who we're talking about. We all know what we're talking about here. The details are incredibly sordid. So if you are curious about kind of the specifics, by all means, like, you can go and research that. But I don't feel that it makes this podcast any better to list those details. I think it would really just make it worse. So we'll just leave it at that for now. In the midst of all these murders, not only did Olson get married and have his son, but he was also arrested and charged with sexual assault, though there wasn't enough evidence to make the charges stick. But finally, August 12th, 1981, he was arrested for attempting to abduct two girls who were hitchhiking. Eventually, he was charged with the murder of Judy Kozma, and within 3 days of the trial beginning, he confessed and pled guilty to 11 counts of murder. However, and this is, like, guys, this is so fucked up. Like, on top of everything else being fucked up, this is really super fucking fucked up. There wasn't any evidence to actually prove his guilt, and without that, Clifford could possibly walk away a free man. So, famously and controversially, Clifford Olson struck what is called a cash for bodies deal, meaning that he wouldn't give details of the murders or the locations of the remains or any of the trophies that he took from the remains, anything that could convict him. He wouldn't give any of that over until $100,000 was paid to his wife, Joan. So understandably, the families of the deceased were enraged because this man who has pretty much admitted to doing all of this is demanding to be paid for it. And they just want to see justice for their kids that they're never going to see again. Like, it's just like, what an awful, awful thing to find out on top of everything else. So there's that. The families did try and fight to have the money recovered because, so yes, they did pay the money to Joan, as in law enforcement paid the money to Joan. The families tried to have the money recovered, but they were unsuccessful. So Joan did get the money and she kept the money, which was yet another sort of layer to the controversy where, okay, Joan, you get the money. How about you donate it to the victims' families or to the charity or whatever? But she didn't. Now, I have not heard or seen a whole lot from Joan, so it's tough to say like where her heart was at with that. You know, was she in on it, or was she completely unaware of it and just kind of wanted to take the money and hide and hope that nobody ever finds out who she is? Like, I honestly don't know. I mean, that's something I guess like we could talk about, but really only Joan is going to know where Joan's heart is at. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. But I did find a transcript of the deal that Olson made with law enforcement. So I'm just going to read a portion of it out here. Olson, I'll give you 11 bodies for $100,000. Corporal Fred Maile. It's spelled M-A-I-L-E. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I'm just going to say Maile. You want $100,000 for 11 bodies. Olson. Yes, and you will get statements with the bodies. I will give you all the evidence, the things only the killer would know. Maile. Well, just a minute. We would have to work something out. I wouldn't just pay you $100,000. You could rip us off. Also, I have to have something to tell or show my bosses that, in fact, you are credible. Olson. Okay, I'll give you a freebie. I will give you one body and a statement. You have the $100,000 in cash. When we are finished at a scene, I will phone, or you will phone, your man who will hand the money over to Joan. Then you can talk to your man and I will talk to Joan to make sure that she has the money. Then we'll go on to get the rest. Maile, what if your lawyer doesn't go along with it? Olson, like I told you before, he works for me. So Olson then had the proposal written out, and it reads as follows. This is an undertaking of an agreement between the RCMP and Clifford Robert Olson. The following will be paid by the RCMP to Mrs. Joan Olson for the following information. $10,000 cash for each body of missing persons. Oh, just thinking about like that just makes my skin crawl. $10,000 cash for each body of missing persons, up to 7 bodies. $30,000 for information of 4 bodies which have already been recovered, which relate to the above 7 other missing persons. The agreement should be as undertaking shall be binding in law as to not disclose this information in the agreement to the Canadian press. The following missing persons are covered in this agreement: Judy Kozma, Darren Jonesrude, Raymond King, Simon Partington, Ada Court, Louise Chartrand, Christine Weller, Terry Lynn Carson, Colleen Dagnall, and Sandra Wolfsteiner, and one unidentified female, Sigrun Arndt, a German student tourist police weren't aware was missing. $10,000 will be paid to Mrs. Olson up to a total of the recovery of 7 bodies. So Olson, because of this, was ultimately sentenced to 11 concurrent life sentences without eligibility of parole for 25 years. However, you'd think that that would be the end of this grisly tale, but on August 19th, 1997, Clifford was stirring the pot again. And by the way, he wasn't just sitting quietly in prison, living out the rest of his life. He was sending vulgar letters to the families of the victims. He was sending pornography to members of parliament. Like, he was being a shit disturber. It's not like he was being a model prisoner, this guy. Like, he really tried to keep the trouble going, even from prison. So he was stirring the pot again when he applied for parole under what's called the Faint Hope Clause. So the Faint Hope Clause of Canada's Criminal Code allows prisoners to apply for early release after serving 15 years of a life sentence. I just want to say right here, and this might, if I have any listeners, I'm assuming I don't, but whatever, that's okay. I don't mind this law because I feel, we still do have instances of wrongful conviction, and we are seeing more and more that there is evidence of coerced confessions and things like that, which I'm not saying is what happened here at all. But what I am saying is I don't mind that there is opportunity after a certain amount of time for prisoners to say, like, look, could you please revisit my case and look at it and have an opportunity to rebuild their lives and this, that, and the other. I am okay with that. It's just the fact that it's, Clifford fucking Olson, obviously, that makes it, really a really difficult pill to swallow. But his application was rejected within about, 15 minutes of the board reviewing it. So that was thrown out. But that didn't stop him from trying again in 2006 and yet again in 2010. So there was a forensic psychiatrist, who testified at Olson's review for early parole, Stanley Semrau. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if I'm not. And this is the forensic psychiatrist. This is what he said about Olson. He can kill, not out of anger or bitterness, but in a light-hearted way, as a sport. Olson himself said that he was addicted to murder and was fascinated by the way children in particular would behave when confronted with death and what that process looked like. Ugh. So to add more controversy to an already controversial case fraught with controversy, it was revealed that after Olson turned 65 in 2005, he began collecting old age security benefits and a guaranteed income supplement in the sum of $1,100 a month. Of course, a lot of people saw that as being a bit problematic. So the laws in Canada were changed. And in 2010, benefit payments were suspended until inmates were released after they had served their sentences. So that has since been rectified in Canada. Finally, after being diagnosed with terminal cancer, Clifford Olson died September 30th, 2011, at the age of 71. Sharon Rosenfeld, that was is Darren's mother, After learning that Olson had terminal cancer, she said in an interview, "I'm trying to come to terms with the feelings of our family," Rosenfeld said from Ottawa. "I spoke with all of my family last night, and we all have mixed emotions about it. My son summed it up by saying, 'Mom, even though he's going to die, we still don't have Darren.'" So, although Clifford Olson has been dead since 2011, I do want to remind everyone, myself included, that the families of these victims have had to carry on without their loved ones for nearly 30 years at this point. So take a few moments, visit the Victims of Violence Fund, victimsofviolence.on.ca, donate if you can, and show that support. I think that's important. So that is all I have for episode 1 of Weird. The sources that I referenced, that I used to sort of build this whole episode, are going to be listed in the show notes on the website, theweirdpod.com. If you liked what you heard, please rate, subscribe, and review on iTunes. If you didn't like what you heard, by all means, don't feel the need to listen again. I will not be offended. And until next time, stay weird.